Very good evening, everyone. Dear participant, with us today, Dr. Koumudi from Department of Humanities, Indian Institute of Technology, Kanpur. Welcome, ma'am. This short
Thank you so much.
Fundamental of Social Design under a Spark project in association with Department of Applied Art, Faculty of Visual Art, Banaras Hindu University, Michigan State University, USA, and Maryland Institute College of Art, Baltimore, MICA. Today, Madam will present the lecture. Madam will present today first lecture. The second and third lecture also coming in this week, Saturday and Sunday. The design and social issues in social design relevance. The first lecture, Madam will cover. This lecture will introduce students to the trajectory of the user in the design process from the early part of the last century to the present, the content, the perspective towards the user from a mere consumer to an end user. Thank you, ma'am, for this. And now again, I am welcoming you to present your lecture. Please.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rara. And a very good evening to everybody. Welcome to level or the module 5 of this course. I will be taking this section or this level in 3 parts or in 3 lectures. The first lecture, as Professor Arora has said, will be more about the user trajectories or the manner in which the perception of the user has changed in design over a period of time. The second lecture will largely be about the theories of designers and educators who have believed in the idea or notion of social design, primarily Victor Papanek, C.K. Prahlad, and Herbert Simon. And the third lecture is going to be more about the application of these theories in the Indian context. We will try to understand what are the dilemmas that designers face when we apply the social design theories onto design problems on ground. So today's lecture, we begin with the user trajectory or the notion of the user in the design theories. I will share my content from here on.
Ma'am, your mic is mute.
I have unmuted it. Is the screen visible?
Yeah, it's a screen visible. Yeah. Please zoom it. Yeah. The screen is not visible right now.
Okay, give me just 1 minute. I'm sorry.
Please assist, ma'am.
Give me just 1 minute. I will just open. I'll just try to share it again. Just give me 1 minute. This lecture will introduce. Okay, is the screen visible now? Yes. Sure. This lecture will introduce you to the history of the user in design and how the trajectory of the design discourse has shifted from user-centric to user-driven design over the decades. Does this designer have a user? Yes. Does this designer do a user study or a usability study? No. Well, traditionally, or in the pre-modern design scenario, designers were like him, almost all of them. All traditional design practices, even today, do not do a user or usability study. And yet all traditional designs have a surprisingly good fit to the needs of the user. Christopher Jones calls such designers unself-conscious designers. Unself-conscious cultures produce evolutionarily fit. Ankit, I'm sorry, but there's a problem in the sharing of the uh, keynote.
Yes.
It went away from my screen for a moment. Okay, I'll repeat this. Well, traditionally, or in the pre-modern design scenario, designers were like him, almost all of them. All traditional design practices, even today, do not do a user or usability study. And yet all traditional designs have a surprisingly good fit to the needs of the user. Christopher Jones calls such designers unself-conscious designers. Unself-conscious cultures produce evolutionarily fit forms in design. They have a certain built-in fixity, patterns of myth, tradition, and taboo, which resist willful change. These designers are not conscious of the design process because designing is a way of life for them. It is not a profession in which they earn their money. Often, these designers design for themselves. They build their own forms, weave their own saris, and throw the pot that they will use in their own homes. Well, this special closeness of the designer and the form leads to constant improvisation to correct the smallest unsatisfactory detail. Each failure is corrected as soon as it occurs. Over time, the form evolves into the best fit, unmatched by any modern studio design. But these cultures, where the user is the designer himself, or the designer is a part of the user community itself, are also slow cultures. Slow cultures are disconnected with the modern pace of life, where designers do not have the luxury to evolve a form. Solutions are needed immediately for users whom the designer knows nothing about. In fact, the designer is called out to empathize with users in order to understand them. The images that you see on the slide are the illustrations of the Great Exhibition of 1851, held in London to celebrate modern industrial technology and design. Industrialization forced designers to become conscious of the design process. That is, it forced unself-conscious designers to become conscious of the design process and compressed the design process to the needs of capital and machine. The client decided how quickly the product had to reach the market, and the machine decided what could be produced. As machines took over the lives of people, design and production was snatched from the hands of the unself-conscious designer and optimized for mass production. Mass production was supported by machines and not by people. Therefore, people did not have a say in what is produced or designed for them. The design of the product and how it is produced are determined not by the producers who make it, nor by the consumers of the product, but by the owners of the capital in the early period of the Industrial Revolution. The owners of the capital shaped the taste of the consumer to buy the goods and services at a price that yielded them maximum profits. This maximum profit could be gained at the cost of the consumer, the producer, or the environment by the capitalist. This led to what Karl Marx would call the alienation of the worker and the consumer from the product in the 19th century. Of course, there were designers and design movements that opposed this alienation of the worker and the consumer from the product. But they did not gain mass following. Arts and craft movement flourished in Europe and North America between 1880 and 1920. The proponents of this movement, for example, William Morris, aimed for craftspeople to derive satisfaction from what they did. This satisfaction was totally denied in the industrialized processes inherent in the compartmentalized machine production. Assembly line production and machines made products that were without a soul. They did not have a human touch. Morris, therefore, was in favor of the idea of the master craftsman creating all the parts of a product and also taking a part in its assembly and finishing, with some possible help by apprentices. The stickly furniture is an example of this. However, the machine won the war, and the hand was ultimately lost in the product. The user or the consumer was nowhere in the picture. If I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses, which implies that if he had paid attention to what the users wanted, he would have never manufactured an affordable automobile. This makes the user look myopic, lacking creativity and vision. However, disruptive innovations like automobiles, phones, or contact lenses are not the only products that are designed, where the user may lack insight. There are several products in the market that could have done much better with user feedback. In the absence of any or little knowledge of the needs of the users, designers often fail to design appropriate products, though their intentions may be very good. The play pump is a good example of this. Play pump was supposed to bring drinking water to thousands of African communities by harnessing the power of children at play. The idea was very simple and by the look of it should not have met with any problems. A merry-go-round type device was installed and connected to a water pump. As children played on the merry-go-round, water was pumped into a storage tank and then made available on demand. The pumps were first installed in 1994 in South Africa and received huge funding, publicity, and media attention. But by 2009, the project was considered a complete failure. What went wrong? Several reasons are cited for this failure. I'm only referring to those that are related to users. The primary drivers of this technology were children. Children were expected to play continuously on the merry-go-round to pump water. But as we all know, children don't play merry-go-round all the time, on all the days. Because both the pumping rate of the system and the number of people it could supply were very high, children's play could not produce enough water to meet the needs of the community. Therefore, adults, basically women, had to operate the play pumps roundabout. Adult women were, of course, embarrassed to sit on the merry-go-round. Therefore, they stood next to the roundabout and turned it by hand. Moving the merry-go-round by hand was a far more strenuous activity than using the traditional push pump. Soon, the community demanded the traditional push pumps and not this innovation. This should give you an idea of how interconnected and interdependent the roles of the design, user, and the context of use are. In conscious cultures, designers are required to empathize with users and use contexts that they sometimes have absolutely no idea or experience of. The gap between the worldview of the designer and the user can lead to several challenges and sometimes complete failure. The design discourse has tried to resolve this gap between the designer and the user through different radical frameworks. We will discuss some such frameworks from here on. The user, as the term suggests, is the person who is using a system. However, users can also be imagined. They can be implicated. They can be potential or real people who are anticipated to use a product or service. The term user is relative to its context and therefore cannot be pinned down into a very narrow set of characteristics. Design has different interpretations of a user, some being more specific or elaborate than others. In order to establish the profile of the user, designers generally conduct multidisciplinary or user-involving activities and iterations of design and its evaluation. This data is often in the form of visual or descriptive representations of users, such as personas, user scenarios, for instance, user journeys. UCD, or user-centered design, is defined as an iterative design process in which designers and other stakeholders focus on the users and their needs in each phase of the design process. UCD calls for involving users throughout the design process via a variety of research and design techniques so as to create highly usable and accessible products for them. The origin of today's user as a central focus of the design process is commonly attributed to Donald Norman and his book User-Centered System Design, New Perspectives in Human-Computer Interaction, which he published in 1986. It became very popular with his second book, which many of you may have already read. If you have not, pick it up right now. The second book was Design of Everyday Things. In this book, Norman argued that if the door does not open, the search button cannot be found, the channel button on the remote is confusing you, and you don't know how to operate the tap in the washroom, the fault is not yours. That is, the user is not dumb because he can't figure out where the sensor for the tap is, or whether it is a sensor-based tap at all. The fault is that of the designer, who was not able to create an intuitive design. Norman mentions several cognitive principles to make the design intuitive for the user. Let us take a quick look at them. Discoverability. When we interact with a product, we need to figure out how to work with it. The more discoverable or visible a design element is, the more likely your users will know about it and use them. When something is out of sight, the probability of its use also decreases. The trade-off between the hamburger sidebar menus and tab bar menus in mobile applications is a very recent design debate centered around this very principle of visibility. While the hamburger menu provides a convenient place to store a variety of menu items in a mobile app, it comes at a huge disadvantage: the lack of visibility of the contained menu items. We have seen a shift in major apps like Facebook away from hamburger menus and back towards tab bar menus to improve the visibility of their key experiences. Here's an example of the hamburger menu and the tab bar. An affordance is a relationship between the properties of an object and the capabilities of the user that determine just how the object could possibly be used. Based on Gibson's concept, Gorman argued that designs have affordances. That is, designs have action possibilities that are readily perceivable by a user. Affordances depend not only on the physical capabilities of the user, but also on their goals, beliefs, and past experiences. If a user finds a flat plate on the door, by all likelihood, the user will push the door. However, if the door has a vertical handle, the user will pull. If the door has a knob, the user will rotate. The problem then comes with the sensor, which is not visible, therefore has no discoverability, therefore cannot be perceived, and so has no affordance. Users in this case simply stand at the door looking for a clue until the sensor senses their presence and opens the door automatically. Effectively, Norman's affordances suggest how an object may be interacted with. Perceived affordances help people figure out what actions are possible without the need for labels or instructions. Designers found this concept of immense use because they could design signifiers to communicate where the action should take place. Signifiers signal things. They are signs, in particular of actions or about actions. Actions that are possible and how they should be done. Signifiers, therefore, must be perceivable, else they fail to function. Affordances determine what actions are possible. Signifiers communicate where the action should take place. Signifiers refers to any mark or sounds, any perceivable indicator that communicates appropriate behavior to a person. Signifiers are signals. Some signifiers are signs, labels, and drawings placed in the world. Some signifiers are simply the perceived affordances, such as the handle of a door or the physical structure of a switch. Mapping is an important concept in the design and layout of controls and displays. Mapping is about having a clear relationship between controls and the effect they have on the world. When the mapping uses spatial correspondence between the layout of the controls and the devices being controlled, it is easy to determine how to use them. Groupings and proximity are important principles from Gestalt psychology that can be used to map controls to function. Related controls can be grouped together. For example, controls should be close to the item being controlled, therefore proximity would play a role. Feedback is communicating the results of an action. It is a well-known concept from the science of control and information theory. Feedback must be immediate. It must be informative and should be planned. Did my money get transferred or not by clicking the submit button? I need to have an immediate feedback from the system, and this needs to be pre-planned by the designer. A conceptual model is an explanation, usually highly simplified, of how something works. Conceptual models are often inferred from the device itself. Some models are passed on from person to person. Some come from manuals. Usually, the device itself offers very little assistance, so the model is constructed by experience. The major clues to how things work come from the perceived structure, in particular from signifiers, affordances, constraints, and mappings. Conceptual models are valuable in providing understanding, in predicting how things will behave, and in figuring out what to do when things do not go as planned. A good conceptual model allows us to predict the effects of our actions. Sometimes natural constraints exist that keep you from performing the wrong action. For instance, if you're trying to remove a screw and you turn it the wrong way, it will not move. Providing physical, logical, semantic, and cultural constraints guides actions and eases interpretation. Many times, constraints are added to a design not just to guide a user, but oftentimes to prevent them from doing harm to themselves or others. Constraints is also about limiting the range of possible interactions between the user and the product to reduce the cognitive load and guide the user to the next appropriate action. This figure illustrates the general user centered design process. UCD is a bottom up process. Therefore, it begins with a deep study of the user's demographic, behavioral, social, and psychographic profile. Designer adopts a mix of quantitative and qualitative research, such as surveys, interviews, observations, or immersions, to empathize with the user. After a period of analysis and synthesis of the user data, designers brainstorm on the design problem to initiate the ideation process. Sometimes, multidisciplinary teams are formed to provide knowledge about the context of use. Multidisciplinary teams are also beneficial to understand other aspects of design, such as technical feasibility or market viability. Usually, a low fidelity prototype is developed and tested to evaluate the design assumptions on use and the user. Based on the user feedback, either the designer goes back to the drawing board or makes iterations on the low fidelity prototype until he achieves a satisfactory result. Before the design is implemented, it is a common practice to execute several cycles of the UCD process. Each cycle adds on to the previous outcome. The 1995 poster of Henry Dreyfuss, an industrial designer titled Joe and Josephine, is a good example of how man became the measure of a product. By extracting statistical data from the military and fashion industry, Dreyfuss created median anatomical representations of mid 20th century American male and female bodies. He did this to improve the ergonomic use of everything from interiors to dinnerware. Dreyfuss argued that designers needed to consider the use of an object by people. He said that any friction between the product and people would prove to a design failure. While whenever people are made safer, more comfortable, more eager to purchase, or just plain happier, a design succeeded. So man became the measure of a product, and therefore the user became the center of the design process. Instead of form follows function, form followed the user. However, the simple and anatomical characterizations of Joe and Joseph are prime examples of what Thomas Friedman would refer to as a flattening of the world. It is the act of replacing human diversity with one single, identityless, frictionless silhouette. It is the process of cleaning differences and individuality and personalities of specific users and converting them into a single archetypical persona of a targeted user. The very things seen to be all too human: psychology, voice, face, expression, breathing, temperature, rhythm, asymmetry, sweat, porosity, breathing, fluctuations, awkwardness, disappear in favor of a single confident line marking the exterior limit of the human. This brings us to the question: what is the role of the user? Is the user an equal stakeholder in the design process? Who can have stakes in the design? And how much can the stake of each holder be? These questions raise doubts on the equitable participation of users in the design process. For instance, how do illiterate users participate in the design of literacy programs? Do they have a stake in what is taught to them and how? Why should literacy in India be about reading, writing, and arithmetic alone? Why cannot and should not literacy be about civic sense, sustainability, or civic rights? By 1970s, questions of these kinds were being raised frequently and persistently. The inequalities being bred through design of not only consumption, but also that of taste, culture, need, responsibility, gender, and the environment, led to rethinking of the user paradigm. The workers' unions in the Scandinavian countries were amongst the first to question the dominance of the design and the designer on the user. The social democratic parties won the elections in 1970s, which strengthened the voice of the workers and their trade unions. The workers and their trade unions fought for establishing participatory methods to directly shape the development of information technology. They sat down with the engineers to design the products designed for them. The Utopia project is one of the finest examples of this process. Utopia became a seminal project on methods for involving end users in all phases of design and development of IT support for their activities. In this project, 6 graphic workers contributed directly in the development of all phases of design and development of IT support for their activities, with engineers, software developers, and managers. The tools and methods developed in this project are used even today in the IT sector. Color slide mock-ups with picture sequences that were also pasted on the walls for simulation of work process. Low-tech mock-ups of equipment, material, and menus. A graphic workstation for illustrating prototypes of computer-based tools. A toolkit for modeling and experimenting with work organization. The focus in the Utopia project was not only on the development of new software tools, but also of rebalancing power relationship in the design and production of products. This marked the beginning of a movement aimed at improving the usability and understandability of poorly designed software by promoting the needs and abilities of those using it. The users were not mere consumers, but also stakeholders in the designing of the design that was targeted at them as the users. A similar project called the Florence Project started in the health sector too. In particular, it worked with nurses and developed approaches for nurses to get a voice in the development of work and IT in hospitals. The Florence Project put gender on the agenda, with its starting point in a highly gendered work environment. As a result, products designed with methodologies involving their targeted users were not only more accessible and appropriate, but were also more acceptable to diverse stakeholders. Therefore, the influence of participatory design on contemporary user-centered methods is most prominently identified in the attempt to develop empathy with the user. Participatory design, then, is a democratic process for designing social and technological systems involving human work. It is based on the argument that users should be involved in designs they will be using. All stakeholders, including and especially users, have equal input into the design of the product and therefore an equal voice. This was the beginning of democratization of design. Participatory design has been practiced in many different forms with different rules of engagement. In some projects, participatory design limits user power to create inputs only for the professional designers to consider. This approach is called consultative design by Mumford. There are also other approaches which give users full power to share in the responsibility for the final design. Mumford calls these processes consensus design. Also, beginning in the 1970s and 80s, an approach to user involvement in design called joint application design emerged from IBM in the United States and Canada. This became a commonly used approach in industry in which user representatives become official members of the design teams, often for the duration of the project. In comparison with participatory design, joint application design is often a bit more about group dynamics, brainstorming, and organizing group meetings. In the early 1990s, the Scandinavian approach to democratic design was adopted and extended within the HCI community in the form of participatory design. But does simply allowing users to sit in on design meetings is enough to achieve participation? The principal method used by participatory design to involve users in design is to have them participate in meetings with design engineers. It is this simple idea that makes this approach participatory. However, this may not always work. This is because the workplace and the design process has its own politics that can intervene in the participation as well as the extent of it. For example, sometimes managers become a part of the user group, but then they may only be administrators. The workers who actually use the design or the technology directly may not be allowed access to such meetings. The politics of the workplace can then hinder the extent of participation to the extent that the power wielded in the managerial positions may resist the participation of low level workers. The higher officers may intimidate lower rank officers in the meetings or discount their authority, skill, or knowledge or experience. Even when managers are not present, the users themselves may not be able to articulate their knowledge or what they need and desire from the new technology. They may even underestimate the value of their own skills and knowledge. For instance, during a small user study of the ergonomics of kitchens at homes in IIT Kanpur, the housewives were invited to participate in the design process. Some housewives were unable to articulate their needs, while others seemed to have accepted that what they have is good. One of them, when asked a direct question on the problems she faced in the kitchen, said that her kitchen is just fine. But when she invited the designers to see her kitchen, The designers observed that she used the stools to stand on because the kitchen platform was too high. The housewife, over the years, had just forgotten that the platform was too high for her. Between the designer and the user in the design process, the designer wields more power and authority. As such, users may not express themselves and simply defer to the authority of these expert designers. Design engineers can also find it difficult to communicate effectively with users. Engineers tend to express themselves in technical language rather than how a technology relates directly to a user. As such, it can be a daunting task for an engineer to describe design alternatives in the language of the users to gather their informed opinions. Similarly, gender poses an additional set of problems to effective participation in design. In a country like India, caste also plays a strong role in participation. All of these political forces tend to silence the voice of users in the design meetings, and a serious effort has to be made to counteract these tendencies. Therefore, a great deal of energy is expended in participatory design to create visualizations and mock ups of proposed systems so that they can be evaluated by users. It is also common to send designers to the workplace to observe users or even train them to do the work of the users of a proposed system. Ultimately, participatory design does not consist of a set of strict rules or methods for how to go about designing systems. Instead, participatory design prescribes an attitude of including users, encouraging their thoughtful participation, and being sensitive to the political and ethical challenges facing designers. Simply working together or talking about the same subjects does not make the act participative. User-centered design process designs for people. Participatory design process designs with people. So, what is the difference between central and participatory design? The user-centric design is passive. That is, the user evaluates and gives feedback on the solutions proposed by the designer. The user does not have stakes in what the product should be. On the contrary, in participatory design, the user sits with the designer on the planning board to strategize the solution and claim its stakes. The user does not make the product, but certainly plays a role in conceptualizing it. So by 1970s, the user who was outside the design process had become a part of it. The co-design movement started around the same time as the participatory design movement. Several designers and scholars use these terms interchangeably because they don't see much difference between participatory design and co-design. The journal Co-Design, published by Taylor and Francis, defines co-design as inclusive, encompassing, collaborative, cooperative, participatory, social technical, and community design. Co-design is the act of creating with stakeholders, specifically within the design development process, to ensure the results meet their needs and are usable. In 2000, C.K. Prahlad and Venkat Ramaswamy popularized the concept of co-creation through their article Co-opting Customer Competence. In their book, The Future of Competition, published in 2004, they defined co-creation as the joint creation of value by the company and the customer, allowing the customer to co-construct the service experience to suit their context. This may seem like a general term, but ultimately, co-creation helps to identify a more specific type of value-based collaboration between stakeholders and users in contrast to standard market research. Another term often used as a synonym for participatory design is collaboration. According to Thomas Keevan, collaboration can be thought of as joint problem solving. It means working with others with shared goals for which the team attempts to find solutions that are satisfying to all concerned. All these design processes, unconscious design, traditional design, user-centered design, participatory design, co-design, collaborative design, co-creation, these all follow the linear innovation model. That is, innovation comes from research and development. It is then marketed and then disseminated amongst end users. But is this always true? Is innovation always a linear, step-by-step process? Eric von Hippel in 1986 coined the term lead user to refer to users who do not follow a linear model of innovation. Lead users face needs that will be general in the marketplace, but face them months or years before the bulk of that marketplace encounters them. Lead users are positioned to benefit significantly by obtaining a solution to their needs, and so may innovate. Lead users are a very important source of innovative progress because they often pioneer new products because they themselves need it. They act earlier than producers and identify a need much before the market pays heed to it. As they are primarily working for themselves, they do not concern themselves with whatever others will also want or what they are trying to develop for themselves is profitable or not. Examples of lead user innovations are abundantly found everywhere. A famous one would be that of Louis Braille. Braille was blinded in both eyes due to an early childhood accident. He is credited for inventing a system of reading and writing for use by the blind in 1884. His system remains virtually unchanged to this day and is called by his name, Braille. The Chabra shunt, designed indigenously by Dr. Chabra and Dr. G.D. Agarwal, is a good example of lead user innovation. Both Dr. Chabra and Dr. G.D. Agarwal are neurosurgeons. In the 1960s and 70s, there was a surge of patients affected by hydrocephalus due to tuberculosis. Hydrocephalus is a condition in which an accumulation of cerebrospinal fluid occurs within the brain. This typically causes increased pressure inside the skull. To reduce the pressure inside the skull, a shunt is used to remove the excess fluid. However, all shunts in 1960s and 70s were being imported and were very expensive. Indian designers and manufacturers were not interested in solving the problem. Therefore, Dr. Chabra and Dr. Agarwal decided to design a low-cost shunt themselves. They designed a slit and spring valve shunt that worked on the principle of gravity and not expensive sensors. Their device costed just about 5,000. Dr. Agarwal opened a factory in Shahjahanpur, a little town in Uttar Pradesh, to manufacture the shunts. And today, it is being used in almost every hospital in India as well as Africa. This low-cost device did not include a designer nor the end user, that is, the patient suffering from hydrocephalus. Here, a lead user saw an opportunity and innovated for his own medical practice. The innovation was worthwhile and the market picked it up. Lead users are also sometimes end users. Louis Braille was a lead and an end user. However, all end users may not be lead users because their innovation may not necessarily be picked up by the market. Jugaad in India is end user innovation of a low scale. Ramya Jose, a 14-year schoolgirl from Kerala, has created a simple pedal-powered washing machine. Her mother had fallen ill and she had to wash the clothes which she disliked. So she invented a washing machine that also doubles up as an exercise machine. The washing cum exercising machine is made of an aluminum cabin which has a horizontal cylinder made of iron net wire. The cylinder is connected to a pedaling system which consists of a cycle chain, pedals, and a seat. The clothes that are to be washed are put in the cylinder. The cabin is then filled with sufficient water and washing powder is added. The clothes are left to soak for at least 10 minutes. Subsequently, one needs to pedal for a few minutes. This causes the cylinder to rotate with the clothes in it, cleaning them thoroughly. The water can be rained out and refilled and the process repeated. Finally, the water is removed and the clothes can even be dried, at least 80% dry, by pedaling for some more time. The machine can be made easily and would not require expenditure of more than Rs 2,000. This is an example of end user innovation who may or may not become a lead user, depending on whether the market picks up this innovation or not. This will be called end user innovation because the market would not have catered to the needs of this young girl. This young girl needed a machine without electricity, that too low cost. The market is not interested in her segment, so she had to design it for herself. She is the end user. She might be the only user. She innovated for herself, not to earn profit. However, let's suppose the market takes interest in her design and creates a business model around it. Then she will be the lead user. In end user or lead user innovation, the designer, that is the professional designer with a degree in his hand, is not involved at all. The user becomes the designer. The role of designers and users in relation to the design process, as well as the design object, has been in constant flux since the middle of the last century. Users are not merely subject of a study or a targeted consumer persona, but active and empowered participants of local resolutions. Consensus emerges amongst active agents in practice, where each agent is an empowered decision maker. Unlike the conventional design world, where a small majority of active designers negotiate for the large majority of passive non-designers or users as consumers. Empowered with social technologies, these communities of stakeholders do not necessarily share a common space, time, or resource. They affect themselves as well as other communities grappling with a similar concern. They practice and learn to practice it better with regular interactions amongst each other in the community. However, such learning trajectories based on the alignment of the design concern in the interest, aspirations, and intentions of the participants are informal and learned in practice. Design world is currently not geared towards such situated learning for non-designers participating in a community of practice. Self-organized learning methods, of course, exist. For example, Levin Winger would have written a lot about it. But scaffolding the learning path will strengthen the emergence and sustainability of such communities, for which the designers and the design world has to work quite a bit. Although pedagogical tools for community of design practices are not yet designed, but advancement of technology has opened channels for the development of artifacts as tools for negotiation and democratization. Artifacts developed for communities of practice mediate collaboration amongst heterogeneous agents, bridging the gap of space and time. Interconnected artifacts assert in the negotiation of content, resources, actions, and conflicts. They also facilitate democratization of participation of agents, their activities, and voices. However, most of such design platforms either do not address a design concern directly or transform the user into a decision maker. But if pursued, they do have the potential to address these lacunas. From the trend of design and innovation models discussed till now, it might be easy for us to conclude that we are heading towards a future with no designer. Community of design practice will emerge as a decentralized model of design, where user and designer will share similar role and power in future. If pursued, we will soon be looking at a completely user-driven system where designer has created tools to empower user to solve issues at local levels. Every agent or user will be acting locally around themselves and change the dynamics of the overall complex problem to a favorable state of a self-organized and self-adaptable system. With the advancement of cloud computing and ICT, we're going to witness such collective actions really soon. We do not really need the designer. The user becomes the designer. The role of the designer then will get limited to being a facilitator. So that was the trajectory of the user and how the notion of the user has changed from someone or some people who are fairly passive in nature to people who have become active and become the center of the design process itself. That is, have become end users or lead users in today's time. So any questions, doubts on what has been discussed till now? Maybe not. So, Dr. Arora, would you like to take over? So maybe we can close the session for today, and we meet again on Saturday around the same time, and we will pick up the next section in this level 5 or module 5 of this course. The next section, as we had already spoken about, will be largely based on social theories that have been proposed by Papanek, Prahlad, and Simon. Thank you.
Sorry, ma'am. I'm just driving. Thankful to you, especially for giving this lecture. Ma'am, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Yes. Yeah.
Thank you, Koumudi ma'am, for giving this very useful lecture in relevance with the social design aspects of design and society. Now, still, I don't receive any questions from the participant side, and hopefully, whenever I will receive the questions from participant side, I will forward to you for the answers, and you will send to me. Then I will forward to the participants. Thank you, participant, for this very important lecture. Now, ma'am, next lecture is on Friday at 4 p.m. and sorry, Saturday, and after that on Sunday 4 p.m. The same topic in continuation of first, second, and third lecture. Now, I'm again thanking on behalf of Banaras Hindu University, Michigan State University, USA, and Maryland Institute College of Art for short-term Fundamental of Social Design course. Myself, Manish Arora from Banaras Hindu University. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Koumudi from IIT Kanpur.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks a lot.